قد جاءت رسل ربنا بالحق ونودوا أن تلكم الجنة أورثتموها بما كنتم تعملون والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبا القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد. يقول الله في المحكم بعد نعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سيقول السفهاء من الناس ما ولاهم عن قبلتهم التي كانوا عليها قل لله المشرق والمغرب يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. I would like to convey my greetings to all of you. It's a great honor as always to be here in the community in San Diego, and I coincidentally happened to be here for a few days, and Agha Sayyid Sabari reached out, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So I thought the topic that I would cover today is something maybe a little different from usual, and this is really a product of the modern media environment. In modern times, we see that Islam is continually under attack across different European and Western nations. Most recently, for example, we have the ban in France of the burkini, this swimwear of the French, essentially banning women from dressing modestly and going onto the beach. But here in the United States as well, it's not easy times for Muslims, and we see this repeatedly across the country. This picture, for example, really summarizes, I think, very nicely the status of Muslims in various communities in America today. These were taken in New York, in a place called Long Island, and the Muslim community over there was trying to build a masjid. So they went to the city council meeting, making a petition requesting building permits for the masjid. And you can see here the Muslim representative, and look at the types of looks that the Muslims are receiving. I mean, I think if a picture is a million words, this picture very clearly sort of communicates the position of Muslims in an environment as open as New York. So this isn't somewhere where we would traditionally think of as being racist. And then, of course, there's also the of course, there's good reason for this, because you notice this is what most people, when you mention Islam, this is the type of, essentially information that they're exposed to. They're either exposed to incomplete information in the form of books such as, by former Muslims. There's this lady named Ayan Hirsi Ali, former Muslim, written a book called Infidel. This is a supposed Muslim, Irshad Manji, writing a book, The Trouble with Islam Today. And then, of course, you have the leading, Republican presidential candidate, of course, talking about banning Islam. So within this environment, it's not really surprising that we have images like this, because the common American individual, the common non-Muslim, is exposed to material like this. And I think the best summary of the state of Islam today actually came from a Jewish rabbi. He's a professor at Hebrew Union College, which is actually in Los Angeles. He's written some really great books about Islam, and I think he's really summarized the situation of Muslims today very nicely in the following statement from one of his books. He says, Islam is perhaps the most misunderstood religion to the West, and many stereotypes still hinder clarity about its tenets and practices. Western prejudice toward Islam is as old as Islam itself. So this is a Jewish rabbi, professor at the Hebrew Union College, acknowledging something which many of us are, maybe feeling in a different basis, that, there are these stereotypes that are perpetuated against Islam. But really the roots of these stereotypes aren't recent. They're not because of, books like these, or because of, language from Donald Trump. But fundamentally, the fear of Islam is something that was always in existence from the very time of the revelation of Islam. So within this context, tonight's talk will be divided into two parts. First, I wanted to talk about the causes of Islamophobia, specifically with respect to the United States. And then, secondly, I wanted to talk about some solutions, specifically wanted to review the history of Islam in America, because oftentimes people don't appreciate how long Islam has been in this country and the contributions that Islam has made to this country. But before we continue, please give me a loud salawat. So what are the causes of Islamophobia, or this fear of Islam? Well, first and foremost, it's really human nature. Specifically, what do I mean by this? Geography. So Islam, as all of you know, originated in the Jazira al-Arabiya, the Arabian Peninsula, and over time it spread radially from this. But the European conception of Islam has always been framed in opposition to the religion, because when Islam first arose, it was viewed as a threat to Christian, the Western Christian empires. So historically, Islam has always been viewed as being the other. But this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran repeatedly, that one of the problems that people encounter when they practice a religion is they view religion as being geographically limited. Meaning what? Meaning Muslims and non-Muslims oftentimes view Islam as a thing which only exists over there. I've heard many Muslims, for example, saying that we'll take our children over there, because over there they'll be raised more Islamically, assuming that Islam exists over there in Azerbaijan and Iran and Iraq, but it doesn't exist over here. And vice versa, many non-Muslims, when you tell them Islam is has origins in America, they'll say, no, Islam is something over there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this concept in Surah number 2, Ayah 142. And this verse was revealed in relation to the changing of the Qibla. Remember, when the Muslims were first revealed the religion, they were praying towards Jerusalem. But then during the migration to Medina, the angel Jibra'il, through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through angel Jibra'il, commanded the Muslims to change the direction of their Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca. And in fact, if you go to Medina, there's a masjid over there called Masjid Qiblatain, which is the masjid of the two Qiblas, because it was during the afternoon prayers the Muslims were praying, and then the Prophet ﷺ received the revelation to change the direction of the salat. And what happened is, when the Muslims changed the direction of their prayer, many of the enemies of Islam, the so-called silly people, started making fun of the Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ. The silly people, the trivial people, the simple-minded people. سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مَا وَلَّاهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمْ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا. What caused them to change the direction of their qibla? قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Say to Allah is the east and the west. He guides whomever He wants to the straight path. The point being that the religion of Allah, or the system of Allah, Islam, is not limited to the east or the west. يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. So the first cause of Islamophobia, I would say, is really inherent to both Muslims and non-Muslims. Oftentimes when we speak of Islam as only being something which exists over there. We see this problem in the Muslim community and in the non-Muslim community. But Allah very clearly tells us, لَيْسَ الْبِرْ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. That the righteousness, or that the belief in Allah, is not the direction that you make your salat in. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lists what righteousness is. The point being that righteousness isn't the way that you dress, or isn't the way that you pray towards Allah, because to Allah belongs the East and the West. Now, this is really important for America, because in the United States, many people think of the United States as being fundamentally a Christian country. So Christianity is over here, Islam is over there. we've heard this from some of the presidential candidates, saying that they want to ban Muslims from coming here because this is a Christian country. But I think the best response to this comes from a professor at Princeton University, a man named Gustav Niebuhr, who says many Americans don't seem to recognize that our country and its individuals, if not institutions, has always been more religiously diverse than it appeared, a trend that certainly continues today. All this gets obscured when people speak wistfully of the United States as a Christian nation. He's saying that the United States, if you look at the history and the traditions, is not really a Christian nation, but it's really a nation that's been composed and that's really been affected by numerous religions. So for the remaining part of this talk, I wanted to look at the Muslim contribution to the development of the United States, because oftentimes this is a story that does not get adequately told, but it's really an important story that we need to understand if we're going to effectively try to counterbalance Islamophobia. But first, please give me a loud salawat. So the solution to countering Islamophobia is, first and foremost, before we expect people to be educated about Islam, we need to educate ourselves about the history of Islam. Both the history of Islam as it developed through the stories of the prophets and the Ahlul Bayt, but just as importantly, we need to understand the history of Islam in the United States and in Europe and in other places. Because if we truly believe that Islam is a universal religion, then we need to understand historically, is that really true? Is Islam, practiced only in the East, or was it always practiced across the world? So we'll begin the rest of the talk with a brief history of Islam in America. But I wanted to start before even America. Before even America was founded, there was a history that many people are unfamiliar with. So for example, let me ask this question. How many of you have heard of a man named Christopher Columbus? Yeah, everyone has heard of Christopher Columbus. Why is Christopher Columbus so famous or so popular? What's really the reason behind people sort of remembering Christopher Columbus? Maybe one of the what did Christopher Columbus do? Discovered America is usually the common answer. Now let me ask you a question. How many of you have heard of a man named Chang Ho? Okay, so Chang Ho is actually a Muslim man. His name is Mahi. Ma is the Chinese word for Muhammad. So this is a man who was a famous explorer. In fact, if you've heard of the stories of Sindbad, it's believed that the story of Sindbad is based on the real life of Chang Ho, Mahi. Now, why is Chang Ho an important figure? Chang Ho was raised as an orphan, or as a eunuch. So his father essentially gave him up, and the Chinese emperor at the time, during the Ming Dynasty, adopted Chang Ho. And so Chang Ho was a Muslim by birth, but he remained a Muslim throughout his lifetime. So he became very close friends with the Chinese emperor. The Chinese emperor loved Chang Ho so much, he asked him, what do you want to do with your life? Whatever you want to do, I can sponsor it. So Chang Ho, or Mahi, wanted to travel around the world. He wanted to be an explorer. So what the Chinese emperor of the time did is he sponsored his journeys around the world. Now why is this important? Because there's evidence that the ships of Chang Ho actually came to the United States something like 70 years before the first ships of Christopher Columbus. There's actually a book by a British historian named Gavin Menzies. The name of the book is 1421, The Year China Discovered America. This book was a New York Times bestseller. And in this book, Gavin Menzies, a British historian, talks about the evidence demonstrating that a Chinese Muslim sailor came to the United States, actually to California, came to the west coast of the United States, something like 70 years before Christopher Columbus ever came to the United States. Now, Chang Ho is really an important explorer for many reasons, but just to give you an idea of the tremendous contributions that Chang Ho or Mahi made to exploration, This boat right here, this black ship, do you see this black ship? This is one of Christopher Columbus's ships. So remember, Christopher Columbus had 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. This is the Santa Maria. By contrast, this is one of Cheng Ho's ships. See how large it is? Now, why is this important? Cheng Ho was able to do things with exploration that modern Western explorers weren't able to do. So, for example, the people who sailed over from Europe, like Cheng Ho, Columbus, Magellan, these other people, a lot of times their people would get something called scurvy. Scurvy is a disease that you get when you don't eat fresh fruit. Because, you know, when you're going long distances on the ocean, there's no access to fresh fruits and vegetables. What Cheng Ho's people were able to do is they were able to avoid having scurvy. The way that they were able to do it is they would take the salt water that they were essentially sailing on, and they would purify it. And they would get fresh water. They would desalinate it using the Chinese technology that they had at the time. And they were able to use the salt water to grow fruits and vegetables on their ships. So one of the things that Cheng Ho and the expeditions and his expeditions were able to do is they were able to essentially develop these advanced technologies. And this is just a map of some of the expeditions that the people of Mahi, Mahi's ships made. The point being that many of us have heard of Christopher Columbus, but arguably the most famous explorer, or the most, I would say, advanced explorer, was a Muslim man named Mahi, Cheng Ho, and very few of us have heard of this man who potentially discovered the United States. Now, is this important? Gavin Menzies, in his book, talks about that, when Cheng Ho came to the United States, he drew a map of the United States, and this eventually went to Turkey, and it was developed into a full-fledged map. That map is called the Piri Reis World Map, and this is what the map looked like. After Cheng Ho's expeditions. This map was developed in the year 1513. Now, why is this important? This is important because the first map in the West that we know of that included all 7 continents wouldn't come up until many years later on. The point being that the product of Cheng Ho or Mahi's expeditions was something called the Piri Reis World Map, which essentially mapped out the entire world as Cheng Ho and Mahi understood it, and it included the United States. Salawat. Now, getting to the United States itself, let's just review some of the key milestones in the United States. How many of you have heard of Lewis and Clark? Lewis and Clark. So they're famous explorers. They're thought to be the first white or the first Europeans to cross the Mississippi River. So the United States people up until that time, the Europeans didn't cross the Mississippi River, but Lewis and Clark were the first sort of adventurers to cross the Mississippi River and to come to the West, and that's what caused people to migrate to the West. But actually, something like 60 to 70 years before Lewis and Clark, there was a Muslim man named Estebanico of Azamor. And this is really a famous story, but many people don't understand it. Estebanico was a North African Muslim who was sold into slavery by the Europeans. So he was sold into slavery in Spain, and then his slave master came and he arrived in the country of Haiti. Eventually his slave master, a white European, was killed. But what ended up happening is that Estebanico, who was a Muslim, his real name was Esteban, which means little Stephen. He ended up in Haiti, and what he ended up doing is he came to Florida, and from the year 1527 to 1539, he became the first non-Native American to actually cross the Mississippi River, and he ended up all the way in Arizona before he was killed by some Native Americans. And if you go to Texas, in Texas they have an entire museum dedicated to the history of Estebanico, who was the first non-Native American, the first European, you could say, to cross the Mississippi River before Lewis and Clark. And it's interesting, if you go to the museum, they talk about the life of Estebanico, and some of the stories they relate is that Esteban, or Estebanico, whenever he would cross the country, whenever he encountered Native Americans, he would try to introduce them to the religion of Islam, according to the museum about Estebanico of Azamor. So here you have this North African, came to America, crossed the Mississippi River, and was proselytizing or teaching about Islam. Now, more fundamentally, probably the most important contribution of Islam to the United States is through the forced slave labor that was migrated to here. It's believed that anywhere from 10 to 30% of the Africans brought to the United States were originally Muslims. So they were all from the Western African countries of Timbuktu and other areas. So many Africans, when they were brought over, they had Muslim names, but they were forcibly made to change them to non-Muslim names. They essentially took the names of their masters. Salawat. Now, Islam didn't just contribute physically and historically, like the stories of Cheng Ho and Estebanico, but also culturally as well. So how many of you have heard of Benjamin Franklin? So everyone here has heard of Ben. He's the man on the $100 bill, right? So he's considered one of the most important founders of the United States. He helped to come up with the government of the United States, the Constitution. He was one of the individuals who wrote the Declaration of Independence. But during his time, Benjamin Franklin was actually embroiled in a tremendous controversy. This was a tremendous controversy in the day, and it involved a Muslim. So Benjamin Franklin was a tremendous lover of Persian poetry. He loved Iranian poetry, so he loved the poets Sadiq, Rumi, Hafiz. He loved one of the poems of Sadiq so much that he actually took it for himself and he translated it into English. And he claimed that he had found one of the lost chapters of the Bible. Essentially, he had gone on an expedition, he had found a lost chapter of the Bible, and he was publishing it to people. Well, when people started investigating the source of the lost chapter of the Bible, they recognized that what Franklin had done is he had stolen one of Sadi's poems, and he had said that this actually was a lost chapter of the Bible. And this is just a picture here of Franklin and Sadi. So this is written about. There's some specialists here that talk that write about this with respect to English literature. So what's the poem that Franklin stole from Sadi and pretended that he had found a lost chapter of the Bible? It was actually the following poem that people now, scholars have sort of elaborated on. And it's really a beautiful poem. Here I have the Farsi, and here is the English. And this poem hangs up in front of the entrance of the United Nations in New York. The poem that Franklin loved so much and that he thought was so valuable that it belonged in the Bible and that he essentially plagiarized or stole from Sadi reads as follows. Human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So when Franklin read this poem, he thought it was so beautiful that it was talking about humanity, that it belonged in the Bible. And essentially he was saying that this was a lost chapter of the Bible that he had rediscovered. But eventually people, when they investigated, they found that Franklin took the poem from Sadi. And there was a big controversy at the time. People said, how can Franklin take a poem from an Iranian poet? But that's what happened. Salawat. So as I mentioned, many of the Africans that came to America, came from the Mali Empire. They came from the kingdom of a man named Mansa Musa, who is arguably one of the greatest Muslim emperors in the history of the world. He's called the Gold Emperor. And Mansa Musa established this big seminary, or this big hawza in Timbuktu. And many of the Africans that were brought over to America were brought over from the Mali Empire. So many people oftentimes, unfortunately, when they read American history, they think that the slaves were just uneducated people coming from Africa, coming from the jungle. The reality is that the Africans that were coming over here as slaves were oftentimes much more educated than their own slave owners. That the Africans that were being brought over from Africa weren't coming from the jungle with, lions and tigers, but they were coming from a very advanced civilization represented by the example of Mansa Musa and his Mali Empire. One of those individuals is actually a man named Abdul Rahman ibn Sori. This is his picture. Abdul Rahman was a prince in the Mali Empire. But what ended up happening is he was captured by some Europeans and he was sold into slavery. And he arrived in the United States in the year 1788. When he arrived in the United States, Abdul Rahman was telling everyone, listen, I'm not a slave, I'm actually a prince. I shouldn't be here in America, I should be there, in Africa, because I'm coming from a very prominent royal family. And of course people didn't believe him because, they say, okay, yeah. We've heard that excuse a million times, maybe. So they've brought him over to the United States. They brought him over to Mississippi, and what ended up happening is Abdul Rahman ibn Sori got married to a Christian woman. She converted to Islam, and he had a family, a big family in Mississippi. One day, some people in Mississippi found out that he was actually a prince, and they submitted a petition to the Secretary of State at the time, who was John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams found out about the mistake of the American government, and they freed Abdul Rahman ibn Sori. They apologized to the government of Mali. They said, we apologize tremendously for taking one of your princes. So they had a big freedom parade in Philadelphia, and they sent him back to Mali. The point being that there were a lot of these types of stories of educated Africans being brought over to America, establishing roots in America, but then, oftentimes, their history gets overlooked. Now, this is another individual that I think is really an important figure in the history of Islam in America. His name is Umar ibn Sa'id. He lived from the year 1770 to 1864. Like Abdul Rahman, he was also a very educated individual in the Mali Empire. He was a hafiz of the Quran, so he memorized the entire Quran. But he was captured into slavery, and he was forcibly converted into Christianity. So if you read the memoirs of Umar ibn Sa'id, they're available online, by the way. The University of North Carolina has translated all of the writings of Umar ibn Sa'id into English, and you can read his journal of the problems that he encountered during his lifetime. So, for example, one of the things that happened is Umar ibn Sa'id, his slave master, forced him to eat pork. So Umar ibn Sa'id, who was a Muslim, was telling his slave master, listen, I'm a Muslim, I don't eat pork. But his slave master forcibly made him eat pork and forcibly made him drink alcohol, just to make him, essentially give away his Islam. But Umar ibn Sa'id remained a Muslim, and in fact, he wanted to, preserve his Islam. He wanted to preserve his memory of the Quran. The reason that I'm telling you the story of Umar ibn Sa'id is because it's believed that he wrote the first Quran in the United States from memory. So he tried to, he would steal, he wouldn't steal, but he would take pen and paper, and whenever he had free time, he would write verses of the Quran that he could remember. And so here, for example, he's written Surah An-Nasr, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Idha ja'a Nasrullahi wal-Fath. This is one of the copies of the very first Qur'ans written in the United States by a Muslim man. This was in the 1700s. Salawat.
there is an error at the beginning. إذا جاء النصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين.
Yeah.
Then the rest of the chapters.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is the problem, because after a time he didn't have a physical Quran,
Yeah.
so he would just.
This is the side effect of the alcohol.
Exactly. Exactly. Salawat. So there's many stories like this of Muslims forcibly changed, and they forget their religion over time, or they essentially come up with some new insights. So I'll just skip over this part, but I wanted to tell you this story. This story happened during the Civil War. So as all of you know, the Civil War was when the United States was fighting between itself. So the northern states were fighting against the southern states, and there were economic and social and political reasons for that. So during one of the famous battles that occurred in Alabama, the northern general arrived at a library that belonged to the University of Alabama. The general's name is General Croxton, and the librarian was a man named Andre Delofre. So General Croxton, who was a general of the northern states, was commanded to burn down the University of Alabama, the library. The librarian begged and pleaded with the general, please don't burn down the library, because this contains valuable books, contains really precious treasures that are not available anywhere else in the world. So General Croxton said, okay, I'm going to burn down the library, but I'll let you keep one book from the library as sort of a souvenir, as a memory of this occasion. And so Andre Delofre had access to thousands of books in the library, but he chose one book to preserve. It was one of the only copies of this book that was available in the South, so he held it very dearly. Does anyone want to guess what book Andre Delofre saved? Yeah, the Quran, exactly, yeah. So this is the Quran that he saved, and if you go to the University of Alabama today, you'll see this same copy of the Quran that was preserved from this entire incident. And when they asked Andre Delofre later on, why, out of all of the books that you had access to, why did you preserve the Quran? He said, because this was such a precious book that we could not, replace it. Linguistically, we couldn't replace it, and then physically, we couldn't replace it. So he thought it was the most valuable book that the collection had. Salawat. And of course, Muslims and Islam has had a tremendous impact on American art and literature. As I mentioned, Rumi and Sadi and Hafiz all had tremendous impact. But they particularly had an impact on the two major American philosophers, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Both of these are considered the most important philosophers in America. They were both from Boston. They came up with a school of thought called Transcendentalism, and they were tremendously impacted by Islam and by Persian literature. And Ralph Waldo Emerson specifically was impacted by Imam Ali alayhi salam. So if you read the journal of Ralph Waldo Emerson, there are several passages where he specifically mentions the lifestyle of Imam Ali and the inspiration that it's given to him and his own lifestyle. And more so, Islam is also impacted on literature as well. So this is a man named Walt Whitman. He's arguably the most important American poet in America. He's written many poems where he mentions Islam, but one of his famous poems, he talks about Allah. So this is his poem. Allah is all is eminent in every life and object. Maybe at many and many a more removes, yet Allah is there. So he's saying Allah is the only sort of presence that's going to be there. Now, I bring this up because this is oftentimes many of the youth we go to school, you read about Walt Whitman, you read about Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, but it's really, uncommon for them to mention the impact of Islam and Islamic thought on the ideas and opinions of these individuals. Salawat. Now we'll move to World War I, and we'll wrap it up in the next 5 minutes. But I wanted to tell you this story because I think it's really a funny story that gives you sort of the idea of maybe some of the misunderstanding of non-Muslims of Islam. So during World War I, the Americans knew that they were going to fight in the desert. And in the desert, of course, tanks and cars don't work very well. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to, essentially train a group of camels in the United States so that the American soldiers, when they fight in the deserts of northern Africa and the Middle East, they could ride on camels. But the problem is, in the United States, no one really knew how to ride a camel or how to raise camels. So what they ended up doing is they went to the Middle East and they went to Lebanon. They brought a man over named Hajj Ali. Now, if any of you have been to Lebanon, you'll know that there's really not a lot of camels in Lebanon. It's not like, Al Jazeera al-Arabiya or Iraq or parts of Iran. Out of all Middle Eastern countries, Lebanon is probably the country that has the least experience with camels. So they brought Hajj Ali over to America, and they gave him something like 100 camels. And the thing is, they couldn't pronounce Hajj Ali, so they called him Hajj Ali. So if you look at the history books, the man's name is Hajj Ali. This is him right here. So they gave Hajj Ali something like 100 camels, and they threw him in the middle of the Arizona desert. But Hajj Ali didn't know how to raise camels. So what ended up happening is all of his camels died, and he left and he opened a restaurant. And if you go to Arizona today, you'll see a grave of Hajj Ali that says the last camp of Hajj Ali. But you'll see that even the grave that they made for Hajj Ali was a pyramid. So, not many pyramids in Lebanon. So the point being that, there's always this tremendous misunderstanding, and you have these stories, many types of stories like this. Now, one of the first white Americans to convert to Islam was a man named Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb. And he was a close friend of Mark Twain. He became a Muslim, and then he started wearing, some of the traditional Eastern clothing, like the imama and the tie. Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb opened up the first masjid, one of the first masjids in New York, on Broadway. But what ended up happening is people were not attending the masjid. So after a few years, the masjid went bankrupt. And when the masjid went bankrupt, they had to close the doors. And when they closed the doors, the New York Times said that this was the fall of Islam in America. That, with this masjid closing, Islam was not going to, expand in America. But of course, like many times, the New York Times was incorrect, about this story. Islam continues to thrive and to grow. Now, one of the first masjids that was actually established wasn't just in major cities, but it was actually in a very small community in North Dakota. This is one of the first masjids that was established in America in the year 1888. It was established in Ross, North Dakota, by a group of Albanian Muslims. They founded this masjid. Now, what ended up happening, however, is after a few generations, the youth were not attending the masjid. So the masjid, because there was no continuing, audience or population, had to close the doors. And many of the youth ended up converting to Christianity or ended up converting to other religions. Now, the reason that I mentioned the example of Ross, North Dakota, is even though they had a beautiful building, their programs were only aimed at the older people and not at the younger people. So the ideal masjid will have a balance between the two. will try to attract both the young and the old, because if you're just attracting one generation, then eventually the other generation is going to disappear, and then the masjid ends up being a museum. And that's what's ended up happening to the masjid in Ross, North Dakota. It's now a museum out in the middle of a field. The point being that we can learn from the example of the previous generations of Muslims that came to America. I'll just skip over this, but I just wanted to talk about the history of the followers of Ahlul Bayt in America. So first, this is just some numbers giving you the number of masjids that have been founded over the years. So in the 1920s, there were maybe 5 or 6 masjids. Really, the peak of masajid came in the 1980s when there was something like 140 masajids that were opened up. And then there was a slight dip, and I don't have the numbers for the 2000s, but today there's over 3,000 masjids from what I've heard. So the first masjid for the followers of Ahlul Bayt was in Michigan. Was founded by Sheikh Jawad Shirri in 1924. As all of you probably know, he came to the United States from Lebanon because there was a big Lebanese migrant community in Michigan. They had asked him to come over to be their religious scholar. He came in 1924 and he founded the first masjid. It was not in Dearborn, but it was actually on the border of Illinois and Michigan here. Now, since the time of Sheikh Jawad Shirri, this is the number of masajid, or this is the decade that the Shi'i masajid have been established. There's actually a great book by a Shi'i professor named Liaqat Ta'kim, who's a professor in Toronto at McMaster University. He has a great book called Shi'ism in America, and he talks about the history of the followers of Ahlul Bayt in America from the time of Sheikh Jawad Shirri all the way until today. And what you can see here is that the majority of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, their masajid were established in the 1990s or in the 1980s. And then in the 2000s, approximately 16% of the followers of Ahlul Bayt were followed. Now, Liaqat Ta'kim in his book has really an interesting survey. What are the major challenges facing the followers of Ahlul Bayt and their centers in America? Well, these are the major challenges, according to Professor Liaqat Ta'kim. The first challenge is facility. So many of the Shi'i centers, they have to continually pay a mortgage, or they have to pay a monthly fee to rent the center. And this is a big challenge in the sense that they don't have finances and they don't have the adequate resources to pay for the facility. The third major challenge is achieving regular attendance. So people will attend during Muharram and Ramadan, but then throughout the rest of the year they won't attend. And this is really, I think, something that's unique to the followers of Ahlul Bayt, because if you go to the other masajid, you'll see that there's attendance 5 times a week during the regular salat, during Ramadan and what have you. So this is another major challenge. Salawat. The other challenges are division in the community. So many of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, you'll find that there's always many groups. So this board of directors is against this group, which is against this individual. So a tremendous division in the community, which is unfortunate, right? Because maybe this board member is originally from, I don't know, Tabriz, and then this board member is originally from Bint Jbeil in Lebanon, and then they don't like each other because their grandparents many years ago had some argument or something, like this. But this is the problem. Now, alhamdulillah, the center here in San Diego does not have this challenge, but many centers have this challenge. It's obtaining a resident alim. And I'd say this is really a tremendous sort of, opportunity. Whenever you have a resident alim, this is really a unifying figure oftentimes, or should be used as a unifying figure. And then these are the other challenges. Now, in terms of the geographical distribution of American Muslims, California is the #1 state, so that's exciting. So, you know, 20% of Muslims in America live in California, followed by New York, Maryland, and some of the other states. So I think that was my last slide, actually, so that's good timing, inshallah. So the point being that, you know, the history of Islam, the ayah that I mentioned at the beginning, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, سيقول السفهاء من الناس ما ولاهم عن قبلتهم التي كانوا عليها قل لله المشرق والمغرب يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم. The silly people will say, what caused them to change the trajectory of their qibla? Say, to Allah belongs the east and the west. He guides whom He pleases to the straight path. The point being that, you know, we have a tremendous opportunity as Muslims in America to really sort of implement and practice the ideal Islam, which is an Islam that's not limited to geography. Meaning Islam isn't just limited to, you know, Mashhad or Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan or, you know, Saudi, or, you know, the Jazeera al-Arabiya or the Emirates. But rather, as we can see from the history of Islam in America, Islam is something that takes off and that really grows in whatever environment it is introduced to. What we need to do as Muslims really is, #1, understand our own history, but then #2, we need to really live our own history as the Imams. You'll notice that many of the Imams lived in places outside of the Arabian Peninsula, and they were able to spread the religion, you know, by essentially interacting with people and telling the story. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to do this in San Diego, in New York, in Los Angeles, wherever else, you know, the Muslims may be living in the United States. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. صلوات.
السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على وعلى أهل بيته المعصومين المكرمين واللعن الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى يوم لقاء الدين. Dr. Sadiq, thank you very much for your beautiful, informative speech. It was an unexpected opportunity that he came and joined us, alhamdulillah. He was invited in a wedding for tomorrow night, right? Where is Dr. Sadiq? Oh, you are here. Okay. It's tomorrow night. Yeah, respecting to us, he joined us tonight to our program, and respecting to him, we will join him in the wedding tomorrow night, inshallah. Don't worry. We have another program. Tomorrow night, we have our seminar, inshallah, in Paradise Point. It's about globalization and Islam. All of you brothers, sisters, especially our dear youth, are welcome, inshallah, to join us. It starts at 6 p.m., inshallah, and then with Jama'at prayer and then dinner. We appreciate greatly the